Kia ora tātou. It is my privilege to be delivering the Fleming Lecture for 2016 was the award, but 2017. I've started a tour of New Zealand. This is my third talk in a 6-lecture series. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey because you need to understand a bit about me and where I've come from and why I'm so passionate about urban ecological restoration. But first I want to pay homage to Sir Charles Alexander Fleming. Born 1916, passed away 1987. I was privileged to meet him on one occasion when I was a student, and I was at the opening of what is now known as the Egmont National Park Visitors Centre. While I was here at university, I got to know his work extremely well. I've still got the textbook from when I was a student, The Geological History of New Zealand and Its Life by Charles Alexander Fleming. He was raised an ornithologist. I departed from birds at age 11, so there was a bit of a difference there between us. But he also was the person who provided the framework of understanding how our New Zealand flora and fauna is so unique. And the map on that graph, on the diagram up there that you can see, is his summary of what is known as the biogeographic elements of the New Zealand fauna and flora. I can still remember answering the exam question here at the University of Waikato. List 3 elements of the biogeographic elements of New Zealand and explain their dispersal mode and their timetable in arrival. 20 marks. I got a pretty good mark for that one. You also need to know a little bit about me, because that will, I think, give you an insight into why I have this strong interest in ecological restoration. Ko Bruce Clarkson aho, ko Taranaki te maunga, ko Manganui te awa, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, kei Kirikiri roa he noho ana I Naianei, kei te whare wānanga o Waikato, ahau e mahi ana. Tēnā koutou katoa. That explains why I'm in this space tonight. My upbringing on a farm at the foot of that maunga, it's no surprise that I became first what you might refer to as a natural historian and naturally evolved into being an ecologist. Those were the things that influenced my thinking. You now know a little bit about my background. I now want to give you a little bit more background about conservation biology before urban ecology, because I posed that question, the new frontier. And in order to understand that, you need to know a little bit of history about conservation biology in New Zealand. So it really started with Richard Henry in 1894 when he translocated some native birds onto offshore islands to help them escape from the predators, the weasels, the stoats, the rats and the mice that kill the chicks and eat the eggs. And that work was followed up by some amazing work from people who are in the audience tonight. Offshore island restoration by the New Zealand Wildlife Service in the period around about the 1970s. That evolved gradually into another conservation approach that we refer to as the Dock Mainland Island approach. And again, there are at least one person in the audience tonight, Alan Saunders, I saw him out there in the lobby, key individuals in this progress towards sustained and intensive predator control on the mainland in order to look after our fauna mainly, but also our flora. That has evolved today to a scenario where we have in Aotearoa, New Zealand, 73 sanctuaries at least scattered across the mainland or the near shore mainland, and the significant shift that has occurred has been one away from control of projects by government agencies to one of 42 of the 73 projects community-led. That has been the most significant shift in the way we operate in New Zealand in recent times. Now, you need to also know that I wasn't always an urban ecologist, and it's almost as if there was a plan. I had no knowledge of this plan, but I need to tell you about the plan. Because I was born beneath the maunga, and because my first interest was in volcanoes and vegetation recovery after volcanic eruption, little did I know that I was setting the scene for my future in urban ecology. I was lucky enough to work for the DSIR of New Zealand, and I got the opportunity to work across all of the volcanoes of New Zealand. And I used methodologies, working alongside my wife Bev, who's also here tonight, what's called the chronosequence methodology, where you use space instead of time, where you know the age of a land surface, and you can construct a story based on sampling different aged land surfaces. I also used data collection from what is called direct monitoring, where you measure a plot and you measure everything inside it, and then you go back again 5 years later or 10 years later to learn how the vegetation has changed. And as I got better understanding of the discipline, I also realized that combinations of the two approaches were the most powerful of all, because the chronosequence relies on an assumption that all of the sites of different age that you're comparing have the same environmental conditions. Sometimes meeting that assumption is quite difficult. But if you can use chronosequences in combination with direct monitoring, then you have a form of verification. And last but not least, I've been involved in what are called field experiments, where you add a plant to the system or you remove a plant from the system. Of course, you do that with the permission of the Department of Conservation. And you also make sure that after you've run the experiment that you go back and remove the offending party, if you like. But this can be very revealing in understanding how plant assemblages come together, how they develop and evolve and change over time. And so to show you some of that, this is the sort of work that I used to do before I got into urban ecology. This is a chronosequence from Hawaii, 5 years to 130 years, starting with the larva being colonized by the lichens and the ferns, progressing through to the arrival of the first flowering plant, and in this case, Metrosideros, the relative of our New Zealand Pahurakawa ohia, growing on the site there, and then through to 130 years where the ohia is starting to bulk up and beginning a new young forest. Taking it through to 150 or 300 years, a model system of how plants assemble, how they form a new ecosystem, how they achieve what we call canopy cover. The trees close over, dense canopy cover, and the change in the environment that leads to the colonization of the shade-tolerant species, and in this case, the tree fern Subotium, which is a close relative of our native Cyatheas. And being a scientist, of course, I couldn't just rely on the pictures. I had to produce the graph. This is the classic graph of succession on Hawaiian lava flows, from 0 years to 400 years, showing the lichens and the mosses dominant at first, giving way to a fern at an intermediate stage, but the line to really look at is the red line of dominance by Metrosideros, taking over at about 100 years and then becoming the late successional, or some people might say climax forest at 400 years. So what that work taught me was about the biotic and abiotic limitations in natural successions, using nature as the baseline, natural systems as the baseline. And I'm not going to go through all of the detail there, but those are the key points summarized from a large number of publications I've been involved in. And some of the points there that are most relevant to what we're going to talk about shortly relate to the fertility status of the soil and the differences between a natural succession and one in an urban system, but also about the importance of understanding your local flora and your regional flora and how that moves across the landscape, how it disperses and how it colonizes, and most important of all, in that last point, what are the species that are the pioneers, the one that pave the way for the others that follow afterwards? How do they facilitate or change their environment to allow other species to come later and form that late successional vegetation? These were all key learnings that I was acquiring when I was doing this work originally, which stood me in good stead later. So I'm now going to turn to urban systems and an urban world. And of course, we all know that the world is becoming increasingly urbanized. 54% of the world population currently living in cities, and the projection for by 2050 of 64% of people living in cities. And also knowing that cities have the major impact on our environment. It's really important to remember that it's not just occurring within the footprint of where the city is based, but way beyond the edges and the reach of the actual footprint of the city out into the region, out into the nation, and even globally, because cities consume enormous amount of resource to keep them going. London, 125 times its land area, Tokyo 3 times the total area of Japan, and also to know that the average world citizen, when you do the calculations currently, the eco-footprint of 2.7 hectares, when there are in fact only approximately 2.1 hectares of bioproductive land per capita available on the earth. And as the great Mahatma Gandhi said, earth provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not every man's greed. I've been doing a lot of thinking about this problem and thinking about how we might find some solutions to it. And at a recent conference that I attended in Wellington, which was called the Crazy and Ambitious Conference, the crazy and ambitious idea, or the new way of looking at this is, what if cities are viewed not as the problem, but the solution to saving our indigenous biodiversity? And so my talk is now going to cross over on mainly focusing on nature, native plants and animals. It will stray sometimes into green space, and it's set within a way broader context of natural capital. So I need to tell you a little bit about urban ecology itself. Urban ecology is a new discipline. It's only been around in the world for about 20 years or so. And it is a discipline which focuses on understanding ecosystems that include humans living in them, living in cities, in urbanizing landscapes. It's an emerging interdisciplinary field that aims to understand how human and ecological processes coexist. Some people have talked about it as coupled ecological, sociological, and cultural systems combined and coexisting. And above all, how it can help us, how it can help society with their efforts to become more sustainable. So now I'm going to get to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and tell you a little bit about urban centres in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and how I've been approaching this problem. So 87% of us in New Zealand live in urban centres. But of course, when we say urban in New Zealand, the question is, are they really cities? I'll get to that in a minute. Notice that all of our cities, except 2 major exceptions, the one we're living in here in Hamilton and Rotorua across the way, are located mainly in the coastal zone. And that is the zone that it has had the greatest depletion and degradation of our natural ecosystems. That's another reason why, if we can sort things out in cities, we might be able to sort things out for biodiversity more widely on the landscape. So are they actually cities? First thing. Well, actually, probably not. Most what we call cities in New Zealand are probably just big towns, with the exception of Auckland, which clearly is, because of the trouble that it's having, is clearly a city. Small land areas, low population densities, but the focus of my talk is actually about the ecology. And the last bullet point there, I'm going to be weaving into my story. Native vegetation cover in the built-up area of New Zealand cities ranges from less than 1% to 8.9%, compared to international situations where in some cities in South America, for example, 30 or 40% of the city has natural vegetation still remaining, and even Perth in Australia has approximately 25 to 30% of its natural vegetation still existing within the built-up matrix of the city. So I've done some research with some colleagues which has tried to understand, using a surrogate for biodiversity, native vegetation cover, how it's distributed on the landscape in urban environments. And this is our methodology, a GIS system using some fancy algorithms to make sure that we're comparing like with like. because every New Zealand city actually has a different administrative makeup. Dunedin, for example, is massive in extent. Hamilton City is only around about 10,000 hectares. Different cities have different administrative setups, and the only way you can compare ecological features is to use a methodology like this. So this is the graph that was derived from that work that we did quite a while back now in 2007, which showed that there are only 4 major distribution types of biodiversity in New Zealand cities if you use vegetation as a surrogate. And there are some limitations to that. So I want you to look carefully at the graph, and you'll see up here the 10% figure, and you'll see a different mode of operation for different cities. And so we have Wellington up here, which is a C curve, starts low, builds, and then declines. We have down here Nelson, which is a B curve, and it starts low, builds, and carries on, the green curve, still increasing as you go out from the center of the city. And the one unique city here that has this strange curve where it starts high in the middle, declines in the peri-urban zone, and then increases on the edge. Well, this, of course, is New Plymouth City. And the one here, unfortunately for us in Hamilton, Napier, Hastings, and Christchurch, is the flat line curve of biodiversity. And that's why I've taken an interest in how you bring nature back into cities. My crazy and ambitious idea that I launched at the conference in Wellington was, what if we decided in every one of these cities that we could all achieve 10% in the built-up matrix? And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about tonight, really. How are we going to achieve that target? So some people say to me, well, why did you pick 10%? Well, it's sort of semi-arbitrary, but I'm going to show you some science behind it as well. And the science rests largely on what are called species area curves and fragmentation curves. But also recently on a paper that was just published in the New Zealand Journal of Ecology gave me great heart, because you know how you like papers that support your ideas? Scientists aren't meant to do that. 5 to 10%, according to Ruffle and Diddham, is the critical point at which looking after indigenous habitat becomes crucial in ensuring that we maintain the full diversity of plants and animals on our landscape. And so I'm sort of holding my case, I think, building my case around these lines of evidence. But this is the one that really is, I think, the most important of all. So these are curves that are developed by researchers from Sweden, Hansky in particular. And the thing to look at here is that on the axis here, the 10% line here is this line, the 10% line. And what it's saying is that when habitat area or fragmentation increases to a point where you have less than 10% of your original extent, there is a massive drop-off in the number of species that can be maintained on the landscape. That's what I'm resting my justification on for my 10% target. So now let's think about Hamilton and what we need to do. So Hamilton nested in the middle of the indigenous biodiversity desert, and with some amazing natural features about 15 kilometres out of town, namely the Hakaramata Range that you can see on the right-hand side of that image there. And although an extremely attractive city, it is certainly a beautiful city, and it's got this incredible feature, the Waikato River running right through it, which we don't properly utilise in terms of our planning and design. It has suffered greatly in terms of loss of indigenous species. And the reasons for this, I think, are really twofold. First of all, there is a worldview that has been perpetuated in Hamilton City by the European settler, and I'm one of them, so I can point the finger at myself here, that actually native is not good and should be replaced by things that come from my so-called home country. The other thing that's acted against this in cities like Hamilton is the low terrain, the flattish relief has made it a lot easier for people to be extremely efficient at removing all trace of the indigenous on the landscape. And even today, when subdivisions are being developed, some of the development is far from sensitive. These are the last little residue of a native pocket in a gully at a subdivision. See what they did here in the gully? Just removed everything. This photograph is taken from the site of where my house is currently, and I want you to hold this in your mind for a picture I'm going to show you later. There's the tyre dump from the local garage in the gully, and at the back there it's hard to see, but there's a fence line there, and the key point about this is that most subdivision in Hamilton City has come in from the rural area. It's been brought into the city, and it's been subjected to all of the pressures and impacts of agriculture before it was then turned into a subdivision. And that again has acted against retention of indigenous habitat and indigenous species. It's not all bad though. We do have some rather amazing assets within our city, and this slide really is trying to summarize some of that, but it's also getting across the point of how small and how fragmented is that resource that we have here in Hamilton City. Approximately 67 key sites recognised within the city, mean size, mean area, 1.1 hectares. And the best examples of forest remnants left in our city, up on the top left here, Claudelands Bush, or more rightly called Te Papa Nui, 5.2 hectares of remnant dominated by kakatia. And at the bottom, Hammond Bush. And I'm sure there are people in the audience tonight that know both these places really well and have done a lot of the good work to restore these places. Hammond Bush, 1.1 hectares beside the Waikato River. But notice the interior of the Claudelands Bush or Te Papa Nui and just how healthy and vigorous it is now that it's being managed properly. So restoration of existing patches is one thing. And the recipes for restoring patches of forest or remnants in cities are extremely well known. You remove the weeds and the pests, you try and buffer the patch because it's so small, you try and expand the patch or connect it to other patches. But in cities like Hamilton, Napier, Hastings and Christchurch, that is not enough to achieve the 10% threshold that I'm talking about. And what we need in those cities is what we call reconstruction or retrofitting of indigenous habitat. And that's largely what my research has been around in urban environments. So first of all, reconstruction. What is reconstruction? Well, it's certainly moving beyond what we used to do, which is really just revegetation. Where you put a few trees in the ground and you walk away and you think you've done a good job. Well, you know, that's just the beginning of the story. It's about target ecosystems and habitats. It's about bringing back full assemblages and acquiring appropriate species occupancy. It's about building habitat for all components of ecosystems and not just native birds. I am a botanist, remember. So all of the learnings that I took from understanding natural disturbance and volcanic landscapes can be summarized in this diagram. The most important framework that you need for reconstructing indigenous habitat is a natural successional framework. And I'm not the first person to have cottoned onto any of this, of course. In 1983, the president of the British Ecological Society, Tony Bradshaw, said, "The ultimate challenge for ecologists is to reconstruct ecosystems." What he was saying basically is it's all very well studying them, understanding their processes, their dynamics, their functioning, but actually, if you could reconstruct one, you must really know about it. And that's exactly what we've been trying to do. So we've been trying to link natural succession and recovery to restoration and reconstruction, using a successional framework, understanding the different constraints and opportunities presented by the urban environment, and understanding the environmental drivers that make these processes work or don't work. So now let's talk about some of the places where you can do reconstruction. The ultimate place to do reconstruction in Hamilton is in a Hamilton gully. And we've got plenty of them. manga ko tukutuku, and named after the native fuchsia, the ko tukutuku. That gives us a clue about the target, the target that we might apply here. At the moment, though, most of our Hamilton gullies are dominated by what some scientists call novel ecosystems. My view on novel ecosystems is that they're there to be replaced by indigenous dominated ecosystems. You can report me on that, anybody. When you see counter views in the newspapers at the moment, tell them that you agree with me. Remove the novel ecosystem and replace it with indigenous dominated ecosystem. So they are dominated largely by willow in Hamilton here, grey willow and crack willow. They do have some values for birds. Of course, the rural persists where you have old growth willow. And so when you're making your conversion, your reconstruction, you do need to consider transitional processes to make sure you're not taking away values that you want to retain. But having said that, in order to get the full range of species occupancy, in order to get some of the special birds that people love the most, like the tui and the bellwort, it's best that you remove the willow because they do not provide the range of services needed to maintain those birds in the habitat. And so the target ecosystem for gully restoration in Hamilton City is largely one of bringing back kahikatea, pukatea, swamp maori forest. And then, of course, providing all of the services for the birds that we love. I wanted to particularly make reference to swamp maori or waiwaka because the longer I've been in the game of doing the practical restoration myself in Hamilton Gully, what I've realized is that waiwaka or swamp maori is the ultimate ecosystem engineer. It's the one that can really get control of your gully and take the control off the exotic weeds. And it's because of its special characteristics. It's got an amazing root network with what are called pneumatophores. It has breathing roots to survive in very poorly drained sites. And it is a member of the same family as Pahurakawa and Rata. And of course, we're all really worried at the moment about what will happen if myrtle rust gets further south than Kerikeri and starts hitting on some of our key species like the waiwaka. So then the question arises, you can do all of this work and have you actually restored it? Have you reached a threshold where you consider that you've been successful? Here's a couple of examples. On the left, Mangaiti Gully, where you have a community dominated by pioneer sedges, particularly Carrick sector. And here's our own backyard, Bev and I. This is where we hang out at the weekends sometimes when we're not working too hard at university. Kahikatea, flax, swamp maori in the back there. We have got the beginnings, if you like, of that target ecosystem operating in our own backyard. But is 20 years enough? Well, if you go to another site in Hamilton City, here's Seeley's Gully on Armour Street, you can see a place where Elwyn J. Seeley started restoring more than 40 years ago. And the picture here is showing a field trip that occurred in November associated with the Ecological Society conference here in Hamilton. And here is an assembled quorum, if you like, of ecologists, and they are all of the same mind, that we have reached the threshold for restoration because some of the people standing in that stand there came from other parts of New Zealand and they could not believe that actually this was a created, a reconstructed ecosystem. Also, I'd like to, you won't be able to read it at the back, there's a little quote there from Elwyn J. Seeley, the man that started this work. I have every weed known to humankind, but in the end, the bush prevails. So, gully restoration started in about the year 2000, and subsequently here in Hamilton City, we've moved on to another project. It's not a project that's replacing the work in the gullies, it's supplementing and expanding the work in the gullies. 60 hectares, first tree planted in 2004. And there are the target ecosystems for this project in the different colours. A lovely little catchment with a peat lake and all of the opportunity provided by the topography and soil variation within this catchment to bring back representative examples of all of the major indigenous ecosystems that once were common in the Hamilton Basin. And good progress is being made. And here is some of the progress. So 2004, Google Earth, 0 hectares of indigenous habitat. 2016, 31 hectares of indigenous habitat established. Well on target in the next 5 to 10 years to completely reconstruct the indigenous habitats of the Hamilton Basin across that whole area. Right close to the edge of the city, right next to Hamilton Zoo. What an amazing combination and opportunity. The integrated, combined activity of the Hamilton Zoo focusing on conservation of exotic animals, and nearby Waiwhakariki Natural Heritage Park focusing on the conservation of our flora and fauna. How has the work been done? Well, obviously Hamilton City has done a hell of a lot of work, but what is really significant in this project as well is the role of the community. The community has raised, on average for the last 10 years, $132,000 a year for planting alone. It has provided the volunteer labour to replant Waiwhakariki, and it's done so at events like Arbor Day. June the 2nd this year, if I've got the right date, Friday, June the 2nd this year, you all need to be at Waiwhakariki to do the next planting. Notice what was achieved here. 1,800 people turned up, largely school kids, 28,000 plants, 3 hours of work, 3 hectares planted. Well, actually, there's a bit of planning goes in behind that, but I like giving those statistics. A bit of work goes on beforehand, but you know, you can see it happen before your eyes. So this is where the research comes in, and those of you who are not in the science area may find this a bit different, but I'm hoping you'll take some of this on board, because in order for any one of these reconstruction projects to work, they need to be underpinned by good science. It's the connection between theory and practice which leads to the outcome, the implementation on the ground. These are the topics that myself and my research team, and there's a whole bunch of them sitting on the front row there, my PhD students, my master's students, my colleagues, have been working on since at least the year 2000 to try and do the good science that underpins reconstruction. First thing you need to know about your city, you need to know what are the native species in your city, and you need to know what are the species that grow in the region, because you need to know what is missing from the system and therefore what needs to be brought back. Quick statistic there, 343 species there in the region, and Hamilton City total 195 vascular species. The ones that are overrepresented in our city are pioneers and wind-dispersed species. That's where the traits come in. Traits are important in determining what survives in the system. And as well, knowing this, and knowing that when you're doing reconstruction or restoration planting, are you using the full range of species that you could or should be using? And currently in restoration planting across New Zealand, only a subset of what could or should be used is available if you were taking instead a systematic approach. So the statistic again there, probably the most startling statistic, in the urban setting, only 26% of the understorey species are found in restorations compared to the reference sites out in the rural zone. Things do get better. Here's the chronosequence approach being used alongside direct monitoring, and it's simply demonstrating that in 3 age classes, native species richness is increasing with time after restoration. It's also, unfortunately, indicating the arrival on one of those little bars to the right of each of the stacked columns, the arrival of some troublesome exotic lianas. It's also, on the positive side, showing how even without any action from humans, epiphytes can arrive and start colonizing on the plants that you've planted. Most notably at Waiwhakariki, and this is where this data comes from, what it's taught us actually is that sometimes you can get a huge advantage because if you reconstruct on a pasture or agricultural land, you get control of the site from the beginning and you do not have the same weed problem that you have as if you go and try and restore an existing patch. And so what this is showing is the decline over an 8-year period of all of the pasture plants and weeds that once grew on the site as the natives assert themselves, and also showing the rise of natural regeneration. So, you know, the beginning of success is when the plants that you plant on the site become reproductively mature and start producing their own seed. And so this, over an 8-year period, is showing the early development of that process. One thing that we have learned from this work is how quickly some native plants can become reproductively mature. Kahakatea, which lives for 800 years, can be reproductively mature within 8. No one would have thought that unless you were doing this sort of documentation through time. So, you know, it's a good sign. Regeneration is the sign of the beginning of your success. But it's more complicated than that. And this diagram is unfortunately a little complicated, but I want you to focus on some clusters here. Each one of those points represents the composition of a sample. In the green area, it's the samples of the vegetation on the site. The blue are the plants that are recorded in what we call the seed rain. Those are the plants coming in from outside the site. Those are the plants coming from the trees that you already have on your site. And then the third cluster here is what's known as the seed bank. To be successful in long-term reconstruction, you are essentially running a contest. The contest starts with planter bag 3. You put the plant in the ground, you get the plant growing, it becomes reproductively mature, it starts producing its own seed. You then have to remember that you still have to deal with the plants that come in from outside your site. So you're trying to increase the probabilities that when a seed falls on a suitable site in an urban environment, that the plant that will come up will be a native and not an exotic. We've shown that over a period of 20 years, you can begin to shift the seed rain dominance as well towards native. See, the arrow here is increasing native dominance. The last part that you have to control, the hardest part of all, is the seed bank because of the persistence of some exotic species. But the game is a numbers game. Get the numbers up in every one of those components, vegetation on the site, seed rain and seed bank, and you will eventually reach the threshold where natives start to dominate all components of the system. You're also up against predation with plants. So interesting to remember, of course, that not only do all of those pests eat birds, some of them, like rats and mice, also eat seed and seedlings. And this experiment was simply to show the impact of predation on some late successional species. Down the side here, tawa and litsea and hino. And it's simply showing that if you cage the seed, this is just proving the impact of predators. If you cage the seed, this is the rate of loss. And if you cage the seed there, and if you don't cage the seed, this is the rate of loss. The figures are significant. 58% of the seed will be lost, compared to 4% if you cage and protect the seeds. But what can you do to trick the predator? And this is also what our research has been trying to do. It's been doing things like remove the flesh from the seed, add a clay coating to the seed. If you do those sorts of things, you can reduce the predation loss to 35%. So we're trying to learn these techniques, if you like, to give the natives half a chance. You also need to understand how the system changes in response to the things that you've been doing on the site. And this is a model developed recently. Kiri, the senior author, is in the audience tonight. And it's simply showing that in these sites in Hamilton and in New Plymouth, there is a significant threshold reached here at about 20 years, where as you achieve canopy cover and you have a more stabilized microclimate, that's the shift in microclimate, in humidity, a shift which occurs both in soil temperature fluctuation and a shift which occurs in humidity fluctuation, that's when you start getting the boost of regeneration. It's also when you get much greater establishment of native epiphytes on trees. All of these things are showing significant thresholds that can be achieved in order to show that you're starting to win the game. One further example, enrichment is something that you must do. You don't just stop with your pioneer crop, you've got to then step in and do some what we call enrichment or enhancement planting. And these fancy models simply show that survival and growth increases with canopy ages, with one proviso. There's a bit of a dip in the model here which shows that if you have too great a dominance of some species, it will depress regeneration. And the one to watch out for here is manuka. When people plant manuka in monocultures, it actually will encourage some regrowth, but it will actually depress some species and prevent them from coming on and eventually reaching the canopy. And then, of course, those terrible weeds that we're dealing with, Tradescantia. Some of you may know it as wandering willy or something like that. Tradescantia. A different experiment here showing what happens if you clear the weed, if you mulch around the seedling plant, the late successional tree you're trying to establish, Bioschmedia tawa, or what happens if you do nothing. And what this research has shown is that the growth rates are best when you do nothing, but you make sure that you put the sapling in the ground at least 1 metre height so that the Tradescantia cannot overwhelm it. Different parts of New Zealand, they'll have to be taller. If you go to Northland, it might need to be 1.5 metres because Tradescantia is even more rampant in Northland than it is here in the Waikato. And then just going back to what I showed you before was seedling damage by predators. What about the ongoing damage for seedlings and how can you improve their chances? Here we show a closing up of the data. The difference between caged and clay ball treatment, essentially caged 15% lost, clay ball 15% loss. So after 1 year, you've had a significant impact by just doing simple things like putting a clay coating on the seed. And then there are the special plants, the specialized shrub epiphytes, the ones that actually grow up in a tree and do not come into our city because their dispersal agent might be in low numbers, it might be the keruru or some other bird, or because they've been lost from the system and the habitat in the city is so isolated and so distant from the seed source that they need a bit of help. And this is the sort of thing our team has been doing, and there's some of the team there. There's Catherine climbing up a tree, and Fiona is potting up the epiphyte, and then they're hoisting them up into the tree and re-establishing. And we haven't published this work yet, but I know that the data shows that at least 80% success rate for reintroducing some of these specialized shrub epiphytes into the city. Now, I've been talking a lot about reconstruction and plants, and of course, I do need to remember and remind you that control of predators is also important, but I'm going to give a little proviso here as I move through my talk. So Waikato Regional Council done a marvellous job of funding Hamilton Halo. Intensive pest control, 15-kilometre radius around the city, and by depressing the numbers of the predators leading to what some of us call the Tui tipping point. So in 2009, and people who work and live around this campus here know this to be true, from 2009 onwards, Tui became a very obvious component of our campus after having been absent for something like 100 years, although the university wasn't here 100 years ago, absent for a very long period and now a common sight on the campus. So common, in fact, that people who engage in social media stopped reporting them. It was just a sort of a ho-hum thing. We knew that they were there, so you stopped reporting them. One of the perverse effects of a success like this can be that we take our eye off the other component being reconstruction of indigenous habitat. And success in politicians' minds sometimes is not with full understanding of what is needed to reconstruct a complete ecosystem. So that's just a little word of caution. Other things that are going on our landscape that are helping this process, well, I'm not a great fan of the motor car and I hate the drive to Auckland. But one thing I will say in support of expressways and motorways is the development of corridors which are entirely planted up with native plants. These corridors have proven so effective in other parts of the country. So in Wellington, for example, the Wellington City Council has recently introduced a rule known as the flax setback rule. The flax setback rule is where you don't plant your flax within 1 metre of the edge of the motorway, because if you do, the tui feeding on the korari, the flowering stalk of the flax, will get run over by a motor car. So they are definitely used by our native birds, and they are critical in reconnecting peri-urban zone with the city. And although I'm not going to show you a picture of it, remember the other style of corridor that is being built across most of the landscape in the Waikato, the riparian planting zone. The riparian planting zone also has the same potential as a biodiversity corridor to reconnect the peri-urban zone to the urban zone. But the riparian planting currently will need to think about the principles that I've been talking about. Successional framework. Are you using the best available species to enhance indigenous habitat? So when all of these things start working and coming together, perhaps one day we will have the taonga species, the species that we mostly treasure, the species that are most susceptible to predators, particularly if the 2050 goal of a predator-free New Zealand comes into play. But again, I'm making the plea, don't just focus on the birds, remember the whole of the ecosystem. One day when we put the predator-proof fence around Waiwhakariki, we will be able to start reintroducing birds like the tiaki, for example. The recipe that I've outlined, though, will be different for different cities around New Zealand. Here in Hamilton, it's about restoring our gullies, linking them to the river, the lakes and the forest remnants. We know that we have a potential of something like 800 hectares. These are the old figures for Hamilton City, 9,427 hectares. I think we're over 10,000 now. We've got about 8.6% of our area sitting there available for reconstruction. That means we can start competing head-on with New Plymouth, right? And it should be a competition because that will probably get the result that we want. I know, however, that the people in New Plymouth know that we're up to this. And they are also working on major projects right now to take their 8.9% to 15%. So we're going to have to keep working. We have made good progress in Hamilton City, but we have taken our foot off the accelerator. We've restored about 10 hectares, and 5 or 6 years ago, I thought an estimate of what we'd been doing in gullies was we had reconstruction underway over an area of about 190 hectares, but we have taken our foot off the accelerator, largely due to the lack of funding that is being put into the gully restoration program. I think the gully restoration program needs revival alongside the work that we're doing at Waiwhakariki, and then we truly could head for that 10% goal. We know what the constraints are. We've worked on what the constraints are. We know what the limitations are, and we can do something about them. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I just wanted to remind you of some of the most difficult ones. The altered soil. You know, the altered soil, the altered climate, the pollutants in the system, but these are all things we can deal with. And of course, the overarching problem of social acceptance for things like predator control and the lack of ecological knowledge. So even now, with all of the work that's been going on, people still don't know enough about the species that could be used most effectively for reconstruction of indigenous habitat. The opportunities, though, by far outweigh the constraints. Above all, the city is the place where you can get intensive human intervention. You can mobilise the people at Arbor Day. You can mobilise them in various places. You have the advantage of the lack of grazing animals that occur in the peri-urban and rural zone, and some of the predators, not all of them, but a few of them are less common, things like the weasels and stoats. But above all, the city is the place where you can achieve, this is the nexus of people and the environment, where you can get coordinated interagency action, and you can get that convergence of disciplines and capability that can lead to achieving the 10% threshold. And although I'm a biodiversity freak, if you like, the benefits are way beyond biodiversity. All of the things that this sort of restoration and reconstruction can contribute are listed. This is just a sample of the main things that this will achieve for our city. And the one that I rate the highest of all is the fourth bullet point down, social cohesion. The value of having projects in cities where people come together, people of all ethnic persuasions, of all age groups, focused on achieving a goal that they can all work together on. And I think in 2002, it was McKinney who said, providing a well-informed public could be the most important application of urban ecology. So, when I posed the question at the beginning, you knew it was rhetorical, right? You knew that. You knew that I already believed that urban restoration is the new frontier. And we're starting to do some more work in this space here at the University of Waikato that I'm just going to briefly finish off on. So we know from our own previous work that there's more to be done. And so we put in an application to MB, the major funding agency, recently, and we were very lucky to get some additional new money. We also know that the government has recognised the importance of working in environments in urban centres. And that's demonstrated by the inclusion of the theme on urban in the new environment science roadmap. So there will be more funding to come, I'm sure, and we'll have to have our eye on that here in the Waikato and see if we can't build our expertise and capability in this space. The goal of all of this work will be to enhance the interdisciplinary breadth of our approach and the connection between restoration practice and restoration theory. And we really do need to strengthen that connection. All the good people out there doing the work, making sure that the science is sitting underneath and behind to back it up. Here is the program that's about to start. It started actually only in the last few weeks. And this is just a sense of what it contains. Urban restoration planting, you know why that one's there after my talk tonight. Some work on lizards, some work on predator profiles, the role of Māori and cultural values for restoration projects, urban green space benefits, and cross-sectoral alliances. You know, the role of business and philanthropy in coming in behind all of this work. So the question I really want to pose for you all tonight as Hamiltonians, are we actually doing enough? We're doing some good work, but are we doing enough? I believe that if we came back here in 2050, if we mobilised appropriately, that Hamilton can be a sustainable and biophilic city, biophilic, nature-loving, loving of indigenous native plants, whatever you want to call it. We are sitting in a place where we can make a massive contribution in this area. I also believe that cities will determine the fate of the remaining biodiversity of our regions and our nation and the planet, and that there will be no sustainable world without sustainable cities. I just want to finish by acknowledging a whole bunch of people. I'm not going to list it off. They can read it, and they'll see themselves mentioned there, important people. But there is one person that I will mention, and that's my wife, Bev, who's sitting in the audience here. She is my major scientific collaborator, my major critiquer, the major person who keeps me on track. And I would also invite you to consider the last bullet point. If there's something in the talk tonight that you want to know more about, there is a review paper that was published in 2016 by myself and Catherine Kirby here in the audience tonight in the journal Ecological Management and Restoration, and you can read more about it. Thank you very much.